Amanda Ripley, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Dan. Good to be here.
It's a pleasure. I'm excited to talk to you. This is a subject that hits close to home for me. So let me just start on a high level, on a definitional tip. Can you describe the difference between healthy conflict and high conflict?
Sure. Yeah, so high conflict, which is sometimes called intractable or malignant conflict in the research, is the kind of conflict that escalates to a point where it's no longer about the facts. It becomes usually an us versus them conflict. It feels like there is no hope for the other person or the other side. And our brain behaves really differently in this kind of conflict. We make a lot of mistakes. So all of our existing biases become much more pronounced. And it's sort of like conflict for conflict's sake, right? It's the kind of conflict that becomes a perpetual motion machine where it feeds on itself. And no one can really remember how it started, right? But it's the kind of conflict where eventually you start to mimic the behavior of your opponents. And the most diabolical part is every high conflict I've ever studied or been in, you eventually harm the thing you went into the fight to protect, whether it's your kids or your country, usually without knowing it. So that's the really heartbreaking end game of high conflict, is you destroy the thing you care most about.
And healthy conflict?
So healthy conflict, I feel like it's kind of a misnomer in a way. Maybe we can brainstorm a better name for it, because I sometimes call it good conflict, and that's okay. But basically, it's not without discomfort, healthy conflict, right? So I don't want to suggest it's like everybody's great, it's not. I mean, it's like conflict is a clash, right? It is friction. And so there has to be resistance. And conflict's really essential for all of us to get stronger, to challenge each other, to be challenged. Like, there's no other way to live in the modern world without conflict. But the kind of conflict really matters. So healthy conflict, if you look at the research, is really interesting. You can actually tell without even hearing the words if it's healthy conflict, if it's, two strangers or a married couple arguing about something they care a lot about. In healthy conflict or good conflict, people ask each other more questions. They experience anger, frustration, sadness, all of those things, but then flashes of curiosity, understanding, even humor, and then back to anger, frustration, sadness. So it's like a galaxy of emotions instead of just one or two. So you can see it actually in graphically when researchers at Columbia studied, more than 500 difficult conversations between strangers. You could see this movement, and I think you can kind of feel that, right? Like, you can feel that there's movement in a conflict, and you can also feel in high conflict that you are stuck and that you are having the same hostile, negative emotions over and over and over. It's almost boring, right? Because you feel like you know what's going to happen next. Whereas in good conflict, you're not quite sure.
I have so much to say about all of this.
Oh, good.
I want to just signal to the listener that we're going to go deep on both sides of the coin here, high conflict and healthy conflict, and, sort of how to get out of one and into the other. And there are a lot of skills that I'm big on, operationalizable advice. So we're going to get into that. But let's just stay in the uncomfortable part of the discussion here with high conflict for a second. So you've described it as both a trap and also as something that's magnetic. So it's not just like a trap that you can randomly fall into. It kind of pulls you in too. Can you say a little bit more about this?
Yeah, there's a lot of paradoxes, right, in high conflict. And one of them is that we want in and we want out. Like, there's a way in which it pulls you in. There's something very appealing about high conflict, particularly in times of anxiety or uncertainty or threat. And so there's something very magnetic about knowing for sure who the enemy is, who is good, that's your side, you or your side, knowing that you are better than, right? And having a sort of clean line between us and them. That is what psychologists call splitting. And people do it when they are afraid or uneasy. And then sometimes leaders feed into that, right? Offer them splitting as a explanation for all of their problems or ills, right? So it is something that is appealing and it feels good. There's an energy to high conflict, right? To that righteous superiority, to the sense that you are fighting on the side of all that is good in the universe. It's a very like Star Wars quality to it. And at the same time, Curtis Toller, who was a fairly high-ranking gang leader and now does incredible work interrupting gang violence in Chicago for Chicago Cred, he says that he estimates that about 80% of people who are in high conflict, and now we're talking about violent conflict, want to get out, like quite desperately. If only they knew how. Like they don't feel like there is a way. And I would say that that has been my experience working with people stuck in other kinds of high conflict, like members of Congress and their staff, like nonprofits who have gone to war with themselves over unionizing or other things. There is this kind of misery for most people in high conflict. It's not really why they got into politics or into journalism or whatever it is. And it is a little bit of a slow death by 1,000 cuts for your soul, right? Physically, mentally, spiritually. It is very hard to live in high conflict. It's easy to visit, but to live there is very taxing.
Yeah, like I can feel it in my body as you're describing it. Because not only
Isn't this fun? Isn't it fun to have me at parties?
Yeah, exactly. Yes. By the time this comes out, what I'm about to say will be public, although as we're recording it, it's not public. But I've been in a nearly 3-year-long separation process from the meditation app that I co-founded. I'm definitely not going to characterize the mindset of my counterparties, my now former co-founders, but I know in my own mind, I lapsed in many ways into high conflict, and it has just been it's just been unbelievably difficult to deal with. So when you're talking about all the downsides of high conflict, I'm just kind of putting it through that lens, just to say.
I appreciate your sharing that. It's probably not easy to talk about, and also sharing it with a humility about your own experience as opposed to assuming. That's hard to do, I think. Do you get that sense of being pulled in and also wanting to get out?
Yes.
That tension? Yeah.
Yes. And again, I don't know if it ever became high conflict on their side. I just know that as I look at, and we'll get into it, you've got some questions you can ask yourself to diagnose whether you're engaged in high conflict in any aspect of your own life right now. And so as I look at those questions, many of them are no, like I don't, it didn't, for me, get that far, but it got pretty far in my own mind. And, sleeplessness, for example, or carrying on an argument in my own head. Because one of the things you usefully do in your book is talk about how there's the external aspect of high conflict, and then there's the internal aspect of high conflict. And so when I'm referring to high conflict in my own experience, it's really the internal side of it that I see myself in when you describe high conflict.
Yeah. And I think I'm glad you said that, because I think that is where we need to start always. Right. And I resisted this for a while because, I'm later to understanding meditation and mindfulness than you are. And I'm, in some ways allergic to sort of things that feel too kind of woo-woo. And this might be my old school journalism persona getting in my own way, which I think you can probably relate to. But I think I have come to realize that the only starting place with conflict is internal. Like if you can at least try to stay in good conflict in your own head, because there's a lot we can't control outside of our heads, right? And so, but if you can at least do that, and this is what I tell people who are really stuck in really conflict that's way out of their control, right? Even, Civil War level conflict. If you can work every day through a lot of the practices that you talk about on the show to stay in good conflict in your own head, you will be less miserable and make fewer mistakes, sleep better at night, and you'll be able to see when there are openings in the conflict where you could actually do something useful. That won't fix everything, right? But it'll destabilize the conflict system that you're in. You'll be able to see those. And you really can't see them when you're trapped and you're sort of bewitched by high conflict.
Bewitched, yes. I keep thinking about Al Pacino in The Godfather 3 saying, I tried to get out and they sucked me back in. And, it just speaks to the bewitching, or as you also say, magnetic nature of high conflict, even if it's just internal. And I want to be clear, there's so many things that we talk about on this show that really help me. I think pull myself out of nosedives, not always, and maybe sometimes several weeks too late. And we'll get into that for sure, because we're going to talk about some very practical things that we can do. But let me just stay at a high or a higher level just for this beginning part of the conversation. Let me go to the question that I was describing earlier, which is this kind of diagnostic that we can run. How does somebody listening to this show, especially since this is coming out in the middle of the 2024 presidential election, how does somebody listening know whether they have crossed that line between good or healthy conflict and high conflict?
Yeah. So these are like, 10 ways to know. This is like, there's a few cues that, at least for me, have been really helpful, because I can now catch myself sometimes 2 weeks too late, as you said, but sooner than I ever did before. So, there's some kind of high level cues, like language to listen for. Like, do the people in this conflict, including you, use sweeping or grandiose or violent language to describe the conflict, even if it's not violent? Are rumors or myths or conspiracy theories present? Do some people withdraw from the conflict altogether, leading to the appearance of just two extremes, right? Does the conflict seem to have its own life, its own momentum? Those are all signs, because there's, high conflicts can be violent or not. They can last for decades and decades or much less. So there's not just one form it can take. But one thing to pay attention to is the language you use, and also the language you use in your own head, right? So I write in the book about Gary Friedman, who's an incredible conflict mediator and expert who taught me so much about conflict, introduced me to meditation. But he ran for office really late in his career, late in his life, and thinking he could, as a conflict expert, do some good. So he ran for local office in California. And as he put it took about 1/8 of a second before he fell into high conflict. And one of the things that I noticed in talking to him about this and sort of following him through this was that he described his election victory, because first he won, right, as an unprecedented landslide. Okay, which was an odd way to describe the results of an unpaid volunteer community election, right? But you can hear the grandiosity in the language, right? And then he and his advisor started talking about good people and bad people, all right? This is another sign that you're using kind of splitting language. Another sign is that he felt like there were rumors being spread about him all the time. And maybe there were, right? But that's another sign, right? Also, the kind of flexible people in the community stopped coming to the town meetings because it had gotten so ugly. So there again, you're left with two binary extremes, or it certainly feels that way. Just like you see on Twitter or in politics. Like anytime humans get into this false binary sense that the whole world can be split in two, we make a lot of mistakes. And the conflict also seemed to have its own momentum. Everything he did to get out of the conflict made it worse. And this is probably the lesson I've had to relearn over and over again myself, is that in high conflict, anything you do, any intuitive thing you do to get out of the conflict will probably make it worse. So you have to do counterintuitive things, which takes some preparation and practice. You can't just do it under stress. That's not going to happen. So these days, most of my time is spent doing trainings and workshops for people who are stuck or trying to not get stuck in high conflict. And most of what we do is practice the counterintuitive moves. And those are really powerful, especially today. Like, we're just living in an age of conflict, right? And so a lot of our institutions are designed to cultivate high conflict. So that means you kind of have to be countercultural. and that takes a little bit of practice.
Just a note to the listener, we're going to get into the practices. But again, just staying on the sort of at a higher altitude for a few more minutes. A couple more questions. You referenced that we're living in an age of conflict or high conflict. What's going on in our culture that's making high conflict more of a salient feature of our lives?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of things you and your listeners already know about when it comes to the ways our news diet has become very fragmented, when it comes to the ways social media really incentivizes dysfunctional conflict, right? Anonymous conflict, contempt, politics, our, winner take all binary system with two parties is a recipe for high conflict in many ways. And we know that countries that have proportional representation or multiple parties, more than two, tend to be less polarized on average. So there's a bunch of things that are happening at once, but I think that's all kind of like granular. I think high level, none of us know exactly what's causing this, but my best guess is that the ambient level of anxiety and fear is such that people are splitting in a way they didn't in the past. And they're very vulnerable to people, leaders, pundits, politicians who exploit that fear and anxiety. And part of that fear and anxiety is manufactured. And part of it is the pace of change is wild. Like, it's just easy for us to forget. But when the typewriter was invented, it took like a century and a half for it to become like every day. So, now things are changing at a speed, socially, economically, physically, all kinds of ways, spiritually. They're changing at a speed that, as Krista Tippett says, mammals weren't really designed to live in that level of change. So I think that's part of it. But I'm curious if you have things you would add to that.
I think I co-sign on everything you just said, and I would add at least one more thing, which is a lack of social interaction. I like to use the deliberately provocative and somewhat annoying term of love, a lack of love. Everything in our culture militates against social interaction. It's individualistic, which of course predates the cell phone. Individualism does, but then cell phone and social media, which we should put social in scare quotes, drive us further and further into our own little worlds. We've got helicopter parenting, overscheduled kids, making all of that even worse. And I think we know this from it's not complex. We just know that the nervous system is girded by healthy interactions with other people. And you live a longer, happier, more successful life if you've got positive relationships. And you take that away, especially with a global pandemic, and the results are pretty clear. So that's my addition.
Yeah, that's right on. Yeah, I think that's right. And it reminds me of when you put social media, socially in air quotes, it reminds me of Esther Perel talks about AI, artificial intimacy, right? So like the way we feel like we're in constant touch, we feel, but it's a kind of, it's a like a veneer, right, of connection, and it's very thin, but it's enough to keep us coming back. Speaking of the paradox of something being magnetic and repulsive. I think that's how most of us feel about our phones, right? Like it pulls you in and you want out. So it's a very ambivalent relationship, much like with conflict.
The other high level question I wanted to ask you about was, and you referenced this earlier, but what does high conflict do to the brain? I know in your book you say that it lowers the IQ, but can you say more about that?
Yeah. So when you are in a state of high conflict, you literally lose your peripheral vision. Interestingly, this was also true in states of extreme duress. So my first book was about human behavior and disasters, and you literally get this kind of tunnel vision if you're in a gunfight or a terrorism attack. You cannot see, and some people literally lose 100% of their vision or their sense of hearing, which is wild. The same phenomenon happens in high conflict. Less dramatic, right? But you do lose peripheral vision and you start missing things. So you start missing opportunities because you're making a bunch of assumptions about the threat, the other person, the other side. The same thing happens with couples experiencing, who are fighting, right? So we know that couples experience spikes in cortisol when they fight, a stress hormone, right? But so do political partisans after their candidate loses an election. But in chronic high conflict, cortisol injections become recurring, which we know that cortisol impairs the immune system, degrades memory and concentration, weakens muscle tissue and bones, and accelerates the onset of disease. So it is a kind of poison, like a low-key poison that you're sipping off of when you're in this mindset.
Okay, one last. I know I said my last question was my last establishing question, but there's one more. Is it ever right to engage? We're running down high conflict here. We're demonizing high conflict, but is it ever right? High conflict?
Sure. I think there are times where getting in that mindset of kill or be killed can be incredibly energizing and motivating. It can bond people together. That kind of mindset of us versus them thinking can be incredibly galvanizing. Many social movements are built on this, but you know what? Many social movements have died on this too. It's the problem. Because you start to demand purity. You start to demand a kind of orthodoxy in the movement. You start to imbue everything with sort of moral meaning, and then you turn on each other eventually. It's very hard to build a social movement on an us versus them mindset and not eventually use it on yourself. So I think the times in which it's a good idea are very rare, and you wouldn't want to do it for very long, right? For all the reasons we've discussed.
That lands for me. One of the things you say in the book is that you sometimes hate being the person in the conversation counseling others against high conflict because you feel the pull too. And your point, I believe, is that the point that you make to your interlocutors in these cases is like, it's not about morality. It's not about, our cause is just, I agree with you. It's really just about what actually works. And good conflict or healthy conflict is more likely to get us to the goal.
Yeah, I am very pragmatic at this point. But it is counter to my nature sometimes because I'm kind of like one of those people who was a born fighter. Like I can get passionate about things. I used to really like to argue. I like to sort of make my case. I think we all kind of learn these habits as a kid, right? How to respond to conflict. And my way was always to kind of lean into it, not to avoid it. And I guess what really is difficult to communicate sometimes right now is that I am not suggesting for a second that any of us avoid conflict. those are not the options. Like the options are not just avoid conflict, pretend it's not there, hope it'll go away, put my head in the sand, or do what we've been doing, like go to war, counterattack, assume we understand the other side, particularly in politics, right? I'm talking about now. Those are not the only two options. So that is itself a false binary, right? And trying to communicate and find new creative ways to name this is a big challenge. But what I'm trying to say is, yes, we need conflict. We need more conflict, but it needs to be the kind of conflict that makes us stronger. Just like when you go to the gym and lift weights, you need resistance and friction, and it's unpleasant, and you don't always want to do it, right? It doesn't feel great, but you emerge from the gym stronger. And that's what good conflict does, is you walk out of there feeling like you understand yourself, the other person, or the world a little bit better. And I think for me, that's become a much more exciting goal than resolution or compromise or bipartisan unity. Like none of that is actually that interesting or useful. But understanding is very powerful, because then it opens up, it lets a little light in, right? And we can see opportunities when they arise.
Okay. You've done a great job of helping us understand the slim number of pros and massive number of cons to high conflict. So let's get a little bit practical here. You talk about 5 steps for either avoiding, which is easier, or getting out of, which is harder, high conflict. And the first of the 5 steps is, and this is your term here, investigate the understory. What does that mean?
Yeah, so every conflict has the thing that it seems to be about, and then the thing it's really about. Right? So think about any recurring fight that you've had with a significant other or that you see in the news. Immigration, guns, abortion, right? There's a surface level conflict, which is about to build a wall or not build a wall, or how many people are coming in under which. But underneath that, the fuel, the engine of that conflict is the understory, the thing it's really about. And it's usually about one of just 4 things. So that's the good news. It's like, it's not an infinite list. And if you can identify, I'll share what those are, but if you can start to identify what the understory is, starting with yourself in any conflict, but also with others, then it gets interesting. Because then you can actually stop having the wrong fights about the wrong thing with the wrong people and have the right fight, like the fight you most need to have, because you know what you're fighting about. So those 4 understories that are most common are respect and recognition. This is a huge one, I think most underappreciated of all. And care and concern, stress and overwhelm, and power and control, right? So underneath all of those is often fear, like a very primal fear. And that's the case with many debates about immigration, crime, other things. But you rarely, and this is how I got started down this path, is like I felt like traditional journalism was not touching the understory of the controversies that we were covering, right? It was just, we were kind of stuck covering the same old tired scripts back and forth, which would change slightly from week to week, but not fundamentally, because we were never talking about respect, power, fear, right? Those things that are really underneath it.
Yes, I'm interpolating back through my journalism career, and that all sounds right. Okay, so investigate the understory. That's 1. 2 is reduce the binary.
Yeah, so that is like the opposite of splitting, right? Trying not to form unnecessary groups, even in your own head. I noticed in the pandemic, I would catch myself doing this. Like I would sort of, and it was amazing how much it would change, like from week to week, or even when I would travel for work. If I was in Florida, I would have a different set of groups and binaries in my head versus in Washington, D.C., where I live. But I would catch myself at first being very, for example, when my son's school shut down, and it shut down for what I consider to be quite a long time. At first, it was like we were all one. We were all on this team together, worried about this virus, trying to be supportive. And then in time, when school didn't reopen, I felt myself forming groups. It was us versus the teachers who didn't want to go back, right? Or us versus the teachers' unions, and sort of lumping people together, which is natural and not totally untrue. But here's the thing. There's a lot of complexity in there, right? There were teachers who were torn about whether to go back. There were teachers who were afraid for medical reasons. There were teachers who desperately wanted to go back. And when you start creating those groups, you miss all of that complexity. And it's easier, right? It's easier to know what's right and whose side to be on. But it's also harder because then you can't make any progress on the problem. Like you can't start to actually meet people where they are, talk in ways people can hear, understand the nuance of people's struggle. So anything you can do to avoid that splitting, even in your own head, is really, really helpful.
The third is to marginalize the fire starters. And then there's a lot to say in this category. So let's start with what you mean by fire starters.
So fire starters are the four conditions that seemed to be present in every high conflict that I looked at, from small-time political conflict, like we talked about earlier with Gary, to gang violence in Chicago, to civil war in Colombia. Every time these four things were present to different degrees. So those they're sort of like tripwires that lead to high conflict that you want to watch out for. The first and probably most powerful is humiliation, right? When people feel like they or their group was up on high and has been publicly brought low. That is Evelyn Lindner, who studies conflict and war, she calls humiliation the nuclear bomb of the emotions. And it is a sure way to supersize a conflict, right? If you humiliate someone, even if you didn't intend to, right? This is where it gets tricky. But you can see where obviously social media and other things make humiliation at scale really easy and tempting. But humiliation is a big one. Nelson Mandela says there's no one more dangerous than one who's been humiliated, even when you humiliate him rightly. And I love that little addendum there. But okay, so humiliation, false binaries, which we've talked about, that splitting of the world into us and them. Corruption, when you can't trust institutions or each other. Whether the corruption is real or perceived doesn't matter, right? Because that's when people take conflict into their own hands, right? They take vengeance into their own hands. And then violence is much more likely. And once you get violence, you get more violence, and it's very hard to interrupt, right? So the last fire starter is the presence of conflict entrepreneurs. So these are people or companies that exploit and inflame conflict for their own ends. And you can see this in all kinds of ways. You see literally war profiteers, right, is one extreme level, people who trade in weapons, but also every high conflict divorce lawyers will tell you there's someone on the perimeter who's kind of fueling the conflict. And as soon as it seems like they might come to an agreement, it comes right back to life. So someone, maybe it's a lawyer, maybe it's a sister, maybe it's a boyfriend, whatever. Somebody is kind of fueling that conflict. So mediators, the good mediators out there know they have to figure out who are the conflict entrepreneurs here. And can we distance the couple from the conflict entrepreneurs? Or if not, can we bring them into the room and understand them better? Which is, again, a very counterintuitive move, but it's important to at least recognize conflict entrepreneurs in your orbit and try not to be one.
I have a bunch of follow-up questions on these fire starters. Let's start with conflict entrepreneurs. I have a bunch of questions about this, but let me pick up on the last thing you said. How do you know if perhaps you are being one, and you're fanning the flames of, you think you're trying to be supportive, but you're actually fanning the flames of something?
Yeah. I mean, I every day, just think about this. I think it is very easy to be one. It's really a golden age for conflict entrepreneurs right now. There's a lot of incentives. You get a lot of attention. You get paid to be a conflict entrepreneur right now. One way to know is if you literally feel delight at the suffering of others, all right? If that is maybe the only thing that gives you relief. Usually hardcore career conflict entrepreneurs have some internal pain that they have not been willing or able to deal with, and they are spreading it around. So I'm talking here about people who are really doing this for years and years. Curtis Toller, who I mentioned earlier from Chicago, he witnessed and experienced a lot of violence as a kid growing up on the South Side. And he talked about how later, when he would do violence to others, he would see his stepdad's face in whoever he was trying to hurt, right? His stepdad killed his mother. So there's a way in which that pain if it has nowhere to go, right, it will start seeping out. And it is one way to find relief is to cause other people pain and to incite and inflame conflict. That's a kind of extreme case. But I think when you are on, social media, kind of piling on or delighting in some absurd or embarrassing or foolish thing that someone else said, if you seem to really get motivated by humiliation, if you frame everything as disrespectful, right? Those are all signs that we might be treading into conflict entrepreneur territory. And, it's tricky because I don't want to demonize conflict entrepreneurs, right? Because then we're just back to the binaries. But I will say that there are some really incredible people out there who are doing God's work when it comes to preventing violent conflict, who were themselves once conflict entrepreneurs, including Curtis, right? So just because someone is a conflict entrepreneur now doesn't mean they always will be. But that old cliche, hurt people hurt, is true. And the old addendum to that, healed people heal, is also true.
I know you don't want to demonize conflict entrepreneurs, so maybe this question will help. What if I feel the temptation, either online or IRL, to be a shit stirrer, and I'm cloaking it under, righteous indignation, or just being a supportive friend or a good citizen? Why is it bad for me to engage in this kind of entrepreneurship?
Yeah, I guess in the short term, it's not bad, right? Like there's a lot of rewards. It forms a connection, right, to your friend. It makes you see that you're on their side, right? There's a solidarity that comes with this. I think there's attention, there's power, there's a sense of belonging that is, many people are seeking quite desperately and not getting in normal social interactions, right? So I think in the short term, it's not necessarily bad for you. I think in the long term, we are right back in high conflict, right? Like this is a world in which you are going to harm the thing you care most about. And we've seen this again and again with politicians and pundits and, CEOs who get into high conflict. They end up, if not burning down their own house, then like leaving it quite charred, So an extreme example would be, and it's not even that extreme because it's fairly common, adult siblings who go to war over the estate of a deceased parent and spend the entire estate down in lawyer fees, right? This happens it's not that uncommon, right? So there's an example of how high conflict and this kind of perpetual inflaming of conflict eventually comes home.
How do you know if you're engaged in some sort of conflict in your life, you're in the middle of a divorce or you've got a work thing going on or whatever it is, how do you know how do you spot the conflict entrepreneur in your orbit?
Yeah. Yeah, it's the person who seems to come alive when things are going badly, right? Who seems to not come with compassion or accompaniment, but with a kind of excitement. And sometimes this is most obvious, on TV news, right? Where there are people who their best ratings and their best memories are when terrible things were happening, right? Because then they could really hold court, right? With blame and paranoia and fear. Fear is a very powerful, but one of the interesting ways to tell if somebody is acting as a conflict entrepreneur is they start to use the other fire starters, right? So conflict entrepreneurs will frame everything as a humiliation and split the world into good and evil using the false binary, right? And describe everything as corrupt. Like, really, nobody can be trusted if you listen to a conflict entrepreneur long enough, except for them and power, right? So I've found that once you see it, you can't unsee it. I don't know. I don't know if that'll be your listener's experience, but it is a helpful frame, because otherwise it's very easy to just kind of fall under the spell of conflict entrepreneurs. They can be funny, they can be charismatic, they can be compelling in many ways.
Let me go back to humiliation, just to remind listeners or reorient listeners. To zoom all the way out, we're talking about the 5 steps to either avoid or get out of high conflict. We've talked about investigating the understory, reducing the binary, and we're now digging into the third, which is to marginalize the fire starters. And one of the most problematic fire starters, per Amanda, is humiliation, which has been called the nuclear bomb of emotions. When you're in a conflict, humiliation seems like the best possible outcome. So how do you avoid the siren call of humiliating your opponent?
Yeah, right. It feels like winning, right?
Yes.
Like it feels, yeah. William Ury, the negotiator, he has this great quote where he says something like, you can't win a marriage. Like, there's no winning a marriage. And that's something I try to remind myself of, is like, look, we can get separated as a country. We can even get divorced, right? Let's talk about politics. But we have kids together at the end of the day. And just like in a marriage, if you go to war with your ex, who is going to suffer the most? It's always kids. It's kids who are suffering the most from our political polarization right now. It's kids who are suffering the most from the level of fear and distrust that we've got going. So noticing the cost is important. For me, I just try to remove the audience. That's just like a blanket rule. Like, if you are in a conflict with someone, try not to have an audience, because it's hard to humiliate someone if there's no audience, right? I mean, it could happen, but it's less likely. It's the public nature of it. Any great teacher who teaches adolescents will tell you, do not go to the mat on something with an adolescent if the whole class is in the room, right? Like, that's a bad idea. So you want to have a private conversation later, so that they can save face, right? So that they don't feel, what teenagers need and want more than anything else is respect. And that's how they're wired. So if they feel disrespected and degraded and treated like they're nothing, sooner or later, they will make you regret that decision. Whether you know it or not, there is a price to pay for that, for everyone.
Okay, so I think that probably is the answer. If you're engaged in a high conflict or any kind of conflict, and you're laboring under the delusion that the humiliation of your opponent is synonymous with winning, it's a Pyrrhic victory, because you are creating planting the seeds for that person is going to go out and plot revenge indefinitely.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Okay, so the fourth of the 5 steps to either avoid or disentangle from high conflict is to buy time and make space. Can you say more about that?
Yeah. So one of the tricks and traps of high conflict is that things start to move really quickly. And everyone I've followed who works in difficult conflict is, in different ways, just trying to slow the conflict down. You can feel this even when you get in an argument with your kid or your partner, right? Things start to spiral, and then it's very hard to interrupt that. There's different ways to do this, but One way is literally something you just did, Dan. This is probably the best way. So I was kind of going on and on about humiliation and what to not do and blah, blah, blah. And you listened to what I said, like really listened and distilled it into your own language and played it back for me to see if you got it right. Which is, there's different techniques. We like to teach the one called looping for understanding, which is something I learned from Gary Friedman. But it's something that is a way to show the other person that you are trying to understand them, even if you disagree, right? And it has the secondary benefit of slowing down a conflict because it's literally pausing before you offer your response to make sure you're understanding what the other person's saying, right? And it sounds so simple, but I will tell you, it is the thing that has like fundamentally transformed how I move through the world more than anything I've learned in the past 20 years. I mean, it changes every interview I do. I use looping now. Every conversation that has any emotion in it with friends, family, anyone, strangers. It's a very helpful way to stay present and kind of temporarily suspend your ego and try to understand the other person. It is amazing how differently a conversation can go when you do that. Thank you. That was a great example. Like I could feel that you were actually saying it better than I was. And I was like, yes, exactly. And that's when you know that you've looped someone is they say, yes, exactly.
Yeah. I play the little game of how many times can I provoke people to say the word exactly? And I feel the exact same way you do about this technique. It was taught to me as something called reflective listening, but it's essentially the same thing as looping. And your and listeners to the show have heard me yammer on about it endlessly. But just to briefly draw a line under what you just said, that it's so simple and yet has been one of the most transformative techniques I have ever learned. And I'm a guy who goes on 10-day long silent meditation retreats. I do lots of hardcore stuff to get better at life. And this technique, I don't want to get into the losing game of comparing it, but it's just shocking how impactful this little technique, which involves no meditation, no nothing, can be just a circuit breaker on high conflict. Because it instead of popping off and just saying, waiting until the other person shuts up so I can say my thing, I'm forced to listen to them, communicate back to them that I understand them. That relaxes their nervous system. I'm no longer sort of in a reflexive mode. I'm in a much more thoughtful, mindful mode. And then I can say what I need to be heard.
Yes, exactly. I'm so glad to hear you say this because it's hard to explain it in ways that people will believe. But yeah, it is a game changer. I mean, I just did this with a group of, a few hundred people at a public workshop that we held in Ohio with the Richland Source, an incredible media company up there. And we did a little looping exercise. I demonstrated it. We had some fun. And then everybody turned to a stranger and they tried looping each other. And the first thing that strikes you in any crowd, we've at Good Conflict, my business partner, Helene Bianduti-Hofer, she's trained over 1,500 journalists. We've trained another 1,000 non-journalists together in looping. And the first thing you notice is that people are generally very bad at this at first. And we were too, to be clear. Like they so want to commiserate or offer advice or ask a follow-up plot question before they loop, right? And it is very hard for them not to do that for a lot of people at first. And then the second thing they don't always do is check if they got it right. And I am definitely guilty of this. Like I'll be like, I see. So you felt betrayed by the government. And I feel like I'm so proud of myself for like summarizing everything they said that I never say, is that right? And so, but the beauty of checking, even if you just do it with your voice, right? Like, so you felt betrayed by the government, right? Or something like that. Like some doubt, humility, openness that I might be wrong. It is amazing what that does because then people feel like, okay, I'm not sure that's quite right, but I'm going to keep trying. This person's trying. And that is something people almost never feel. People almost never feel like they're understood or like anyone's even trying.
And it is a fundamental human desire. And if you can give that to people, it's like walking around and handing out cupcakes all day. I mean, you're just guaranteed to be a good vibe machine.
So
And
true.
that cupcake thing is not actually random. A buddy of mine had his wife actually would go into the office with homemade cupcakes and just hand them out all day, and so I've never forgotten that.
That's awesome. Yeah, and it's like the least you could do. Like now when I interview people for a story I'm writing, like it's transactional. Like it's kind of a shitty thing, right? Like we interview a bunch of people, a lot of it we don't use. Maybe we don't use what they wanted us to use. Maybe we don't get it quite right. I mean, there's just misunderstandings and neglect all through the system. And so now it's like, okay, well, if I can at least loop this person, even academics, if it's not even emotional, like I'm just interviewing them about their research. Do you know how grateful they are that someone's trying to understand them? And even if I don't quote them and nothing else, at least I've given them that cupcake, right? Like that mini bite-sized cupcake. And that's not a small thing.
Okay, we've worked through 4 of the 5 steps to avoid or disentangle from high conflict. The 5th is complicate the narrative. Say more.
Yeah, so this comes out of something I learned when I was specifically writing about how journalists could cover conflict better based on what mediators and other conflict experts know. And that's that in an age of high conflict, simplicity becomes cliche, right? It's different than in a sort of normal time where, typically we want things to be simplified for us, like so that they're understandable, right? We want stories to be simple. But in a time of conflict, of runaway conflict like we're in, you really want to be suspicious of simple stories, as the economist Tyler Cohen once said. Like simplicity blinds us to what's going on, and it kind of deadens us to curiosity and questions. So there are things that are not complicated in this world, right? I don't mean to suggest, everything's complicated and we should equivocate over everything. No, there are things that are simple. There are things that are wrong. There are things that are awful, right? But people are complicated. That's the thing. It's very hard to find a person who is not at all complicated. So you want to be asking different questions of other people in conflict and also of yourself. So we crowdsourced a bunch of questions from journalists all over the world. And some of our favorite ones to ask to try to complicate the narratives in our own heads and other people's heads are, literally, what is oversimplified about this conflict? Where do you feel torn? What's the question nobody's asking? What do you want the other side to understand about you? Right? These are the kinds of questions, and we have a bunch of them, 15 questions to ask in conflict that you can download for free on our website that just kind of open us up a little bit and get us off of our normal talk tracks. And that's just one way to kind of complicate the narrative and inject a little curiosity where there was none.
How common is it for people to actually pull themselves out of high conflict? Is that you talk about a few stories in your book and you've referenced them here, but in the wild, does that really happen much?
I think it's impossible to do alone. You need somewhere to go, right? So Curtis Toller, when he left gang violence, the gang conflict, as he said, you can't replace something with nothing. Like you need another identity. And so usually when people leave high conflict, whether it's violent or not, it's usually because there's been some kind of shock to the conflict system, something that has temporarily interrupted the conflict, whether it's a snowstorm or, in the case of a high conflict divorce, a sick child, right? Or, in gang violence, someone gets shot and no one visits him at the hospital. Like that's a moment where there's sort of the plates are spinning in the air. After the January 6th insurrection was a great opportunity to interrupt the conflict. But like you're sort of waiting for these moments and then seizing them. And I think that's something that it's easy to think, I'm just supposed to wait until there's a snowstorm and then we can stop this conflict. But you really want to be preparing for that shock, like way in advance. Because if you don't prepare, then people have nowhere to go, right? So I would say most people who try to leave high conflict end up going back to it because they have nowhere to go. When they do leave, it's usually because of their kids or their family. So I would say that's the most common pattern I saw in people voluntarily leaving high conflict because they didn't want their kids to have to live this way. So that is, I think, a really important. Unfortunately, you have to reach a level of misery, like a saturation point, before people will see that. But if and when they do see that and start to really see the cost of the conflict on themselves and the people they love, there needs to be a path out. So what I'm always trying to encourage people to do is to not sever ties with people people you care about, like in your family, who disagree with you on politics or other things. They're going to need somewhere to go, as are you, if you ever decide this isn't working for you, right? So, it's not going to work for everyone. Not everyone should stay in relationship with everyone, obviously. But if you can stay in relationship, you should.
This is an interesting, and I think we may want to pause here for a while, because I suspect some people listening to this are thinking, yeah, don't I need to draw boundaries? But you, Amanda, are telling us, you haven't used these words, but I believe you have used these words, never give up on anyone. And so how do we balance these two imperatives to stay connected because we have kids together, and also to draw boundaries because this relationship is manifestly unhealthy for me?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can have both, right? Like you can have guardrails and you can prepare for those conversations really carefully, which you should. And you can have limits, like these are going to be small doses conversations, right? And there's going to be rules of engagement that ideally you work on with the other person in advance. So you don't just go, expose yourself 100% to whatever is going on here. But you're still in relationship, right? So there's still a tie. One way to do this, and this is what Curtis has taught me, is to issue the invitation. Like you actually have to be kind of transparent about it. To say, you know what? I know we've had these fights in the past over politics, and I kind of hate it. Like I don't like feeling this distance between us. I don't like giving all this power to politicians we don't even know. And I just wonder if you would be interested in doing these conversations differently. So you're literally issuing the invitation. And they might say no, or be suspicious, or say yes, but mean no, right? And you might have to issue the invitation multiple times. But what we've found is that just issuing the invitation slows down the conflict, right? And signals like 10% vulnerability, which is good, right? Like a little bit of vulnerability, like, I'm losing sleep over this. I don't like it. I don't like the person I am when I'm in this mindset. And I'm wondering if you feel that way too, right? And so when you do this, if you can do this, you don't know what the other person is going to say or do, right? But it is good conflict in your own head, at the very least, right? You're issuing the invitation.
I don't think we should underestimate the benefit of good conflict in your own head. I'll tell you one piece of advice, and I've talked about this publicly. One piece of advice that I got from my meditation teacher, Joseph Goldstein, who was a consigliere. That's probably not the right term, because usually in mob movies, consiglieres are like your wartime advisor. And Joseph is not warlike at all, but he was an advisor and friend for me. And, he's played that role for 15 years, but in particular during these last couple of years when I've been in this separation process from what used to be my the meditation app that I co-founded. He one night when I was talking to him on the phone gave me a pair of mantras to use when I was getting into high conflict in my own head. And again, some listeners will have heard me say this before, but I think it bears repeating because I have to repeat it to myself all the time. The first is dead end. As he said, you've thought about this enough. And this isn't compartmentalization. If you change the channel on this talk track, this inner conversation that you're having with yourself or with your co-founders or whatever, it's no longer denial or compartmentalization. You've been having this in your head for years. It's a dead end. There's nothing more to be gained. And so that's very helpful. And the second one was love no matter what, which again doesn't mean, in the as I understand it, in the Buddhist understanding of love, it's not like you have to invite the other person over for dinner. It's not like you're approving of their behavior, but it's basically just understanding. And I know that's a key word for you, understanding they have reasons for what they're doing, even if you don't agree with them. And if you came out of that womb, those reasons would make perfect sense to you, and you'd probably be doing the exact same thing. Or as Joseph says, everybody's just acting out their stuff. And so I found this double-barreled approach to be very useful for me. So I say all of that just to get your reaction.
I love those. I feel like we should create a collection of mantras for people who are in or trying to get out of high conflict or stay out of high conflict. One of the best ones I've heard, and I especially love dead end because it's so short. You know, it's like easy for me to remember because you're under stress, right? When you need these things. So you're not going to be doing a lot of higher thinking. And love no matter what, I feel like I could aspire to. I don't know if I'm there yet, but I'm going to aspire to it. I feel like that's right. But one of my favorites that the Zen Buddhist teacher and poet Norman Fisher told me about is this what he says before he goes in to talk about politics with his cousins who he disagrees with. But he actually is quite good at this, But one of his tricks, his mantra is, we are all going to die one day. Right? Just to remember, everyone in this room going to be dead. So like, relax, this is not the end, but there will be an end and no one will be spared. So it kind of puts you all on the same team, which is part of what I guess we're trying to get to here.
Yeah, I like that. It's the great equalizer, death. I just want to make clear that it's not like the love no matter what thing is aspirational for me too. Okay. It's just like prodding the mind in the right direction.
Right. It's like a ping distant in your brain. Like, remember this.
It's a North Star.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I'm curious, feel free to ignore this or edit it out but I am curious, like when you think about this struggle to kind of stay in good conflict, to avoid high conflict for yourself, in these mantras and all of your practices, I think I'm imagining have been helpful. Have you ever noticed, like, it always feels unique? Like when you're in a high conflict, it always feels at first like this is unique. Like this is not like all the stuff we talk about on the show, right? I know for me, I'm like, well, this is different. And that's also becomes like something I notice when I'm doing that, when I'm like sort of justifying in my head, well, like why this is different. That's maybe a moment to pause. I don't know.
1,000,000%. Absolutely. That is, I think, that's certainly a fallacy that I can see having, surfaced in my own mind.
Yeah, it's amazing how creatively our brain will work to justify, right? This kind of thinking when it's us and when it hurts, right? I mean, I don't know, when we went over those understories, right? Like respect and recognition, power and control, care and concern, and stress and overwhelm. Which of those, did any of those particularly resonate for you, or is there one we're missing, or?
No. For me, and again, I'm just characterizing my own mindset because I wouldn't do that for my co-founders who I just, I've said this publicly and I'll restate it. I know them to be people who are well-intentioned, high integrity. So I'm only going to speak about myself, but I would say respect and recognition, probably, for my understory.
Right. That's the thing. And sometimes it's probably other things, but like that's the kind of root conflict internally. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Maybe some power and control, but I for me, I guess it depends how you define power, but I don't actually really love having power per se. Now I'm the CEO of my own thing, and I don't really love that. I like a more collaborative approach. Even though I have been accused correctly in the past of having a sort of hierarchical approach to things that I learned. I picked up some bad habits, having spent 30 years in television news, which is not often the most enlightened place, although it's getting better behind the scenes. And so I think I brought some of those bad habits into my other parts of my career. Having said that, like for me, there are aspects of power and control that played a part in this situation, but for me, it wasn't really the driver.
It's not the most salient
No.
of the different. Yeah. 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 I think respect and recognition, like I've often told journalist friends, like there should be a respect and recognition beat at every news outlet. Like that is the thing that is like, it doesn't solve anything, but it is helpful to notice it. Do you know what I mean? To notice that that's what this is really about, so that at least we can let other things go, right? I was talking to a politician, a member of Congress who, was having a conflict with someone from the other political party, and they just seemed like they were like dug in on something that didn't make sense. Like it was not in their interest to be opposing this initiative. And so she started thinking like, what is going on? What is the understory here of this conflict, right? And she went through the list and she thought, I wonder if they feel humiliated, even though I cannot think of a single goddamn reason they should feel humiliated. I wonder if that's it. And so she asked this other politician to have lunch, and they did. And sure enough, this other politician felt like they'd been disrespected. No one had consulted them on something that they felt that they were an expert in. And, it was kind of festering. And so she just apologized and restored that sense of respect and recognition in a genuine way. And then they closed the deal and got something done, right? For the people who they are supposed to serve. And so often, if we cannot do that, we will end up stuck in sort of never-ending, silly conflict that feels like mystifying. Like, why are they doing this?
Yeah, my plan going into this conversation was to talk about how to get out of or avoid high conflict, and then to talk about the skills that are involved in good conflict or healthy conflict. You've actually covered many of those skills organically within the conversation. We talked about looping. We talked about focusing on understanding as opposed to agreement, or, finding some sort of solution. But there are a few other skills that might be worth spending some time on. In the book, you talk about something called the contact theory. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so contact theory is just basically the commonsensical idea that if you put people who are very different together and under the right conditions, they will be less prejudiced towards each other and other people like them afterward. This sounds kind of obvious, but it's not. It's quite controversial, but it's been studied. I think there's been 500 different experiments studying contact theory all around the world. So it's like very well studied. And basically what we know is just the way humans are wired to be social creatures for lots of evolutionary reasons. When you put them in a room together and have sort of equal footing, this is important, right? You can't have a huge hierarchy in the room, even though that can be hard to do. But if you do that and you create some kind of shared identity, ideally, like something they're working on together, a problem they both care about, and they have a meaningful encounter, then they do tend to be less contemptuous and biased towards each other and people like each other afterward. And in fact, it's the most proven antidote to all forms of prejudice, including racism. Like there's not another great way, which people don't like to hear, right? But it's like, this is what the evidence shows, that this is the way. You can't just, do it in a haphazard way. You don't want to just, throw a bunch of, Israelis and Palestinians together and send them to summer camp. Like that isn't necessarily what this should look like. It needs to be thoughtful, and there needs to be a lot of effort put into the power dynamics before, during, and after. But this is the way to help us get along with each other. And the good news is you can also experience it vicariously. So when people hear someone on your show that's very different from them, right? If they feel you connecting to that person and they start to understand that person a little bit better, they will experience vicarious contact theory, and they can therefore, they don't literally have to be in the room with everyone all the time, right? Which would be unrealistic. But this is where storytelling and journalism and media is so powerful, is that we can help people experience that vicarious contact theory.
A couple of other helpful tips. Rhythmic breathing.
Yeah, it's funny. This comes up in like different ways in every book I've written, but when I was hanging out with, special operators who were like Navy SEALs and Army Rangers for my first book, they would use what they called combat breathing, right? Which is, there's a million forms, as you know better than I, but often it would be the sort of box breathing where you breathe in for 4, hold for 4, exhale for 4, hold for 4. But the same is true for the same exact reason in conflict, right? It is the best known way to consciously calm our nervous system is through our breath. So the trick then is to obviously practice it, do it all the time, anytime you feel stressed, so that you can do it automatically in real life under stress.
Another recommendation is distraction.
Yeah, it's funny. It sounds so small, but I'm starting to think distraction is like a very powerful force. I'll give you an example. I have one child, and he just left for college. And so my husband and I are sort of wandering around the house, wondering what to do with ourselves. And a friend of mine, her child also left for college. And so in advance of this, she decided that we all needed to do a triathlon at the end of September, group of us, all women, all of whom have kids leaving for college. And her idea was that this would create a distraction. And she is right. Like 100%. Like this morning I was at the track with them and we were sprinting and it was terrible and wonderful. And you know what I wasn't doing? Like wandering around my house feeling sad for that hour anyway. So yeah, intentionally focusing your brain on something else in the midst of conflict can be really powerful, so that we don't have that, it's a way to slow down the conflict. Like Curtis, the gang violence interrupter, he sometimes imagines the young men he works with as they looked when they were little kids, like, toddlers. And he tries to literally talk to them, not as if they're toddlers, but with that kind of vision in his mind. Another woman who does a lot of difficult conversations with strangers will try to, if she finds herself reacting to someone, she will look for something about them that she can delight in. Maybe it's their pink shirt, or a flower in their beret, or I don't know what it is, but just some small thing, or the fact that they're wearing like high top tennis shoes, whatever, like sneakers, like just to kind of distract your brain from the threat signal that may not be appropriate to the moment.
A few other questions, and these are related to the current election season, and just to say to people who are listening in the future, these are relevant anytime, but I think particularly relevant at the moment in which we're recording this and releasing it. What's your advice in the middle of a presidential campaign about how to interact with social media?
Well, the obvious answer that comes to mind is to not interact with social media, but I'm not sure that's the right answer. It's very clean as an answer, but to the degree I can, I'll just speak for myself. I try to interact on social media with things that help me stay in good conflict as opposed to high conflict. And you can sort of feel it, right, when you start slipping. So certain platforms I think are better at that than others. So I don't use X these days, not just for that reason, but I don't know. It just felt like while there was a lot of great interactions I had and a lot of things I learned that I really miss from X, it also just didn't seem set up for healthy conflict, right? Whereas I find sometimes on Instagram, there is healthy conflict, or at least healthy distraction. There's a lot of distraction on Instagram, and that is its own beast, right? But they're depending on your feed and what you're encouraging the algorithm to serve you, can be more energizing than draining. And just noticing your fear response. I think that's important, is to, when you're scrolling your phone or reading the news, noticing when you start to, I mean, you're good at this, Dan, but like, I think for most of us, we have to sort of notice, get better at noticing when our heart rate starts to go up and when we start feeling that fear response. And it's going to be different times on different days, which I think is kind of surprising to me, but it depends on what else is going on in your life, right? But as soon as I feel that, I'm trying to just put the phone down now. It just doesn't serve me. So I don't know. What do you think? What is your answer to that question?
Well, because I've been a journalist for a long time, I've never really engaged in warfare on social media. So it's never, I've never gotten into fights with people I don't know, and because I wasn't really allowed to. I was a journalist. I wasn't supposed to be expressing my opinions per se. So I've never had that habit. But I would say avoiding that seems like a good idea. Generally speaking, the social, to the extent that I post a lot on social media, and that's actually a reasonably new development. But the social media I actually use the most is TikTok, which makes me sound like a 15-year-old boy, but
actually, I think it's a 15-year-old girl, technically,
or girl, yes, or anywhere in the middle. It's that I find it entertaining. I've taught the algorithm to just feed me animal videos and comedy clips, and so it's not polarizing at all. It's a 15-minute break. And I know TikTok has been described as digital fentanyl and it's totally addictive. But actually, maybe this is because I'm old or because I have a mindfulness practice, but I notice like after a little while, like I'm done with it anyway.
Right.
So
it fades. Yeah.
Yeah, it fades.
The attraction fades. Yeah.
But if I need a break during the day, 5-10 minutes of that is pretty reliable. It's not social at all. And I do find that if I look at Instagram too much, that will make me unhappy. It's not positive distraction. It's mostly like a FOMO inflammation mechanism. But if I'm looking at just funny clips, that I like.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of good content out there that does make you feel good feelings, very quickly. So I think it's more of a distraction. Maybe they should call it distraction media instead of social media. That would be better.
So what about traditional news media, or just news at all, whether it's coming from traditional outlets or influencers or whatever? I know you've written about how you have really reduced your news intake, and talked a lot about how the news business, and you've made some nods in this direction in this conversation, should rethink itself in order to meet people's needs. But I want to ask the question from the other side, from the consumer standpoint. Like, what do you recommend for those of us who want to stay informed without losing our damn minds?
Right. Yeah, well, I can tell you what I've come to, because, I did start to realize I used to consume a lot of news content and I enjoyed it. Like I felt like energized. I felt curious, more curious after I read 3 newspapers than before. And at some point, that sort of flipped for me and it became really draining. Like I was less curious, not more. And lots of reasons, potential theories, some of which are my stuff and some of which are the way the world and journalism has changed. But whatever the case, what I've come to as a working everyday practice is that I definitely don't start my day with news. Just like I'm trying not to start my day with email. Like things that really kind of amp up your nervous system in a negative way, you don't want to do like first thing, right? And so I push it because I can. I don't need to be like on top of the news the way I once did. I push it towards the end of the day when I've already sort of lost all hope. So it's fine. You know what I mean? Like there's nothing I can read. And so I'm not squandering that energy like early in the day. And I will now try to like really stop myself and read stories that are actually encouraging of some progress that's being made in the world, because I've noticed that my brain will skip those stories and go to the next threatening story. So I'm trying to kind of interrupt that. I found a few news sources many readers reached, I mean, thousands of readers have reached out with their own suggestions, which has been really helpful. I believe it or not, the Christian Science Monitor is a great magazine, weekly magazine to read that is kind of, this is built into their DNA. Like they are all about covering news rigorously all around the world in a clear-eyed way, but doing it with an eye out for hope and dignity, which is unusual, right? But it's not actually a religious news outlet, even though it sort of sounds that way and has a connection to the church. But I mean, I just suggest people check it out because I do find that I will bring that with me and read it. You know, I actually get the print edition of that, and I will read it at lunch. And I do emerge feeling like more informed, but also a little more hopeful, a little more engaged with the world. And so that is great. And there's others, but I think, you know, generally trying to find news outlets where you feel like they are rooting for humanity. Like, you know, it's not obvious, right? But it's subtle. You can kind of sense it. Like, is this news outlet rooting for humanity or not? Like, are they delighting in suffering, even if they're not seeing it that way? It's not intentional. There's just subtle cues that you can pick up on. And to me, that matters a lot now. Like, like you and I both know that what is decided to be news is, you know, kind of arbitrary. And it's not actually the whole picture by a long shot. So trying to find ways to get a bigger picture and widen the aperture on the world is a struggle. And I hope one day there'll be more options, but that's where I'm at right now.
This has been such a great conversation. I know we went into it thinking we might be able to talk about your prior book, Unthinkable, which is about, you know, who survives disasters and why. But conflict sucked us in as is its wont. Before I let you go, though, can you just tell everybody where they can find out more about you, your website, remind us of your books, just anything you've put out into the world that you think people might benefit from?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for asking. I mean, so AmandaRipley.com is where you can find info on all my books and my writing. And for all the conflict stuff that we talked about, thegoodconflict.com has a bunch of free downloadable resources that I mentioned, the questions to ask in conflict, looping, cheat sheet, a bunch of things that might be useful to people who are struggling. And we actually are very excited because we have our first digital course that is launching this fall, and we'll teach looping and investigating the understory and all those things. And you can sort of take that at your own pace. So we're thrilled to be launching that very soon. Thanks for asking.
Congratulations. That's awesome. All right, Amanda, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me, Dan. I really enjoyed it.